Thank you so much. First question, how's the sound? Everyone can hear at the back? Okay. Well, thank you for that very generous introduction, and since I now live in Texas, I'll start with a Texas story. But when Lyndon Johnson was president, he was once introduced in quite a flattering way, and when he was finished, he thanked the MC, and he said, I want to thank you for this generous introduction. He said, I'm only sorry that two people can't be here to hear it. He said, my mother and my father. See, because my father would have liked it, and my mother would have believed it. Actually, I'm sorry that my mother and father aren't here to hear this. They died when I was young, and there was great influence in my life. But anyway, I want to thank Margaret Benefield and her committee for bringing me here. And I appreciate this invitation for lots of reasons, not least because it's under a seminar for Gerald May. Interestingly, just 2 months ago, I directed a final major research project for a PhD student from Vietnam, but her paper was on Gerald May's interpretation of John of the Cross. And so I appreciate being here. Maybe just because we're going to talk about mysticism, not always the lightest topic, not always the heaviest topic either, but maybe each time I want to start with just kind of a lighthearted story, just to, see whether the microphones are working. But story told of a grandfather who was talking to his grandkids, and he was kind of distressed the way everything's going. He said, I don't understand life anymore. He said, everybody's got a cell phone in their hand all the time. Everything's electronic. He said, we don't have the old values anymore. He said, nothing means anything. He said, $1 doesn't mean anything. He said, when I was a kid, he said, I kid you not. He said, I could go to the corner store with $1 in my pocket, and I would come back with a Coca-Cola, a bag of chips, 3 packs of gum, and a candy bar. He said, you can't do that anymore today. He said, they got cameras everywhere. Okay. Life has changed. But our topic, it's a wonderful topic, they've called it Living a Mystically Driven Life. To live a mystically driven life. Now, obviously, I've stolen kind of the cadence of that title from Rick Warren's famous book, Living a Purpose-Driven Life. Incidentally, he sold 50 million copies of that book, and it is a very good book. So I talked about living a mystically driven life. And tonight, I want to talk about mysticism. Just what is a mystic? What is mysticism? Start with a couple of stories. I hope you have those yellow sheets in front of you because they're my version of PowerPoint. You'll be able to follow. But just some stories to begin with. When I was still teaching in Edmonton, Canada, I used to teach every year. I teach a course on mysticism, or sometimes on a particular mystic, John of the Cross, or Therese of Lisieux. And one year, I'd always start the course, and it was an evening course, and you get a wide variety of students. But I'd go around the classroom and ask, why are you taking this course? What interests you about mysticism? It'd be interesting, we'd go around the room tonight and think, why are you interested in mysticism? And you get very different answers. Some people would say, facetiously, a seminary would say it's, my spiritual director made me take this class. Some housewife would say, it's Tuesday night, and that's the only night I can get out of the house, and so on. But one year, one woman said, because I'm a practicing mystic. And she wasn't making a smart remark. People kind of looked at her and said, I am a practicing mystic. So we're going to answer that question tonight. Can you be a practicing mystic? Well, I must admit you can, and not only you can, you should. Okay? And then secondly, mysticism, it has so many connotations in people's minds, and usually not fully healthy connotations. See, for many people, the word mysticism, it refers to something paranormal, exotic, or it's not ordinary. And so when we think of mystics, we immediately think of, the great mystics, Julian of Norwich, Hildegard of Bingen, John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila. We don't think of Dag Hammarskjöld or Henri Nouwen or people like that, See, so we identify mystics with mystics who have had extraordinary experience. And you're going to see tonight, and extraordinary experience is not the central part of mysticism. And the vast majority of mystics never have an extraordinary experience, Mysticism isn't grounded on some vision from the other side. I don't want to try to define it today. It's grounded on us being in touch with ourselves more deeply, and so on. So mysticism isn't something, and also for many people, it's an elitist thing. If you're really into spirituality and become a practicing mystic and so on. I want to talk about mysticism, and that's its real definition, as something that's deeply ordinary and very importantly ordinary. Okay, so that it's true, and we can talk about that in question period and so on. Some of the great mystics had extraordinary experiences. Julian of Norwich, she had what she called showings, 14 showings, where, actually she was sick and hyperventilating and almost dying, didn't have medication, and inside of that she had these 14 visions of God, But then she waited some years and she traced them out and made sure they were not just delirium and so on. But that's something extraordinary. We have extraordinary mystics, Incidentally, John of the Cross, who's probably the greatest structural mystic we ever had, doesn't rely on extraordinary experiences at all. In fact, he almost had a distrust of them. If he had been your spiritual director, he went and said, I'm having these visions, John would have said, let's not go there. Okay. And even like we'll see, like St. Paul, when St. Paul lines up the gifts of the Holy Spirit, anything extraordinary is pretty far down the list. Remember when he says, how you tell whether God is in your life? By the level of your charity, and it works down from there. The holiest person is not necessarily somebody who's having visions. It's the goodest person you know. Who is the most loving, charitable person you know? That's the most spiritual person you know. In fact, Paul says in the letter to Galatians, he tells the Galatians, you've got the gospel of Jesus, you've got the truth, he says, and even if an angel appears from heaven and tells you something different, don't believe the angel. Okay. I think we'd be pretty impressed if an angel appeared. Paul would say, just keep your hand on the Bible and stuff, that's all you need. Okay. So that's the first point I want to make is mysticism, first of all, long before it's something extraordinary. It can be extraordinary in extraordinary cases, but mostly it's not extraordinary at all. It's nothing paranormal about mysticism. So what is it? Okay. I want a little bit of background to lead into, I want to spend most of the night just defining mysticism from many points of view, and I think you'll get this. Okay. But first of all, it's a struggle with seeing. Okay. I start with a great colorful story. Nikos Kazantzakis was this great Greek writer who wrote Zorba the Greek. Okay. And he was a Greek Orthodox. And early on in his life, he went through a pretty religious phase in his life. And for a while, he thought he'd become a monk. And in fact, he went to Mount Athos and lived in a monastery for a while. And in his autobiography, which incidentally is a very mature, wonderful book, he was dying of cancer, and he wrote a book called Report to Greco, his autobiography. And this is part of it. But he tells a story when he was 19. And he spent a summer in a monastery in Mount Athos, discerning whether he should be a monk. And while he was there, he met an old priest called Father Macarius. Macarius was 87 years old. He said, a very holy man. And the young Kazantzakis was very taken with this old guy. He said, so he talks about the first time he went to the old guy's room. He said, and Father Macarius said to me, Ken, he sounded kind of growly, like he said, what do you want, young man? He said, well, I'm here for some spiritual advice. So Macarius said, well, sit down. Let me have a look at you. He said, so he came, he looked at my eyes for a long time. He said, well, I can give you some spiritual advice. He said, you're asleep. You're asleep. He said, now wake up before death wakes you up. And Kazantzakis said, I told him, I'm only 19. I'm still young. He said, death loves the young. He said, wake up. Okay. Buddhism which we're not going to go into much, but Buddhism would very much define mysticism as a waking up. See, Buddha, you wake up, okay? Christian, we're not exactly going to define it this way, but it ties to that, okay? Now, the second story, we can see without seeing. See, mysticism is going to be, we see with seeing, but I love this text from St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles. When Saul converts. That's a very, very powerful Christological text. See, so Paul, still called Saul, he's persecuting Christians, and he's going down to Damascus to arrest some Christians, and he has this flash of light. We always say he got knocked off his horse, but if you read, there's no horse in the story. Okay, he was just knocked to the ground by a flash of light. And the voice said to him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And he said, who are you? He said, I'm Jesus the Christ whom you're persecuting. Very interesting. Paul had never seen Jesus. He said, you're persecuting my body. We're going to look at that tomorrow when we look at the mystical body of Christ. The reality of Christ's body is the body of Christ. He said, you're persecuting me. Okay, I'd never seen Jesus. But then Saul converts, and he says, okay, I lay my soul open, tell me what to do. And he got his first lesson in Christianity. He said, well, I'm not going to tell you what to do. Somebody's going to take you by the hand and lead you into Damascus, and then somebody else is praying is going to come and tell you how much you have to suffer for the name. It's kind of the way Christianity works. But then, this is the part of the text I want to tease out. They said, then Saul, with his eyes wide open, seeing nothing, was led into Damascus. We always say he was struck blind. It's not exactly what the text says. It says, Paul, with his eyes wide open, seeing nothing. You can interpret that text metaphorically, this sense. I'd like to go to, for instance, as a priest, I do a lot of weddings. Young couples on their wedding day, and if you were there, they walk out of church, eyes wide open, seeing nothing. I was ordained to the priesthood at age 25, walked out of church, my eyes wide open, seeing nothing. And somebody else still has to tell you how much you have to suffer for what you just said. That's what commitments mean. But see this, when the Bible talks about blindness and not seeing, there's always another thing to it. Now Saul was probably physically blind, but that's not exactly what Luke was emphasizing. Because he emphasized his eyes were open, but he couldn't see. That's also true for us in life. Oftentimes our eyes are wide open. We're not seeing. Okay? That's why the next part, in all philosophy worth its name, and in all religions, they have this thing where they say, you don't really see what's out there. You kind of do, but you kind of don't. See, so in Western philosophy, at the axiom, they say, whatever is received according to the mode of the receiver. What that means is we're looking out, but we're seeing mostly what's inside of ourselves. And even at the strictest scientific levels, people, the level of Einstein, Heisenberg, and so on, they said, almost all research is me-search. Somehow we set it up that it's going to, so we don't see what's out there. In fact, let me give you a great story from Buddhism. And so the Buddhists say, you don't see what's out there, you see what's inside of yourself and you project it out, But I'm going to say later on, the problem is we don't really see what's inside of ourselves, okay? We're seeing ego, but not self, okay? But they have this story, they said the Buddha, one day the Buddha was sitting under a tree, and remember the Buddha is always fat. So the Buddha is this big fat figure. He's sitting under a tree, and this young, trim soldier walks past. He said to the Buddha, you look like a pig. And the Buddha looked at him calmly. He said, and you look like God. And the soldier said, well, why would you say I look like God? And the Buddha said, well, we don't see what's out there. We actually see what's inside of ourselves. He said, now I sit under the tree all day. I think about God. And when I look out, that's what I see. He said, you must be thinking about other things. Okay. I think you get it. Actually, my brother was a Saskatchewan farmer. He's a great joke on this. He said there was a grandfather, and he used to take his 5-year-old granddaughter out for ice cream every Saturday morning. Grandpa would pick up the young girl, take her out for ice cream, and she liked this. But one Saturday morning, Grandpa couldn't take her out for ice cream, so Grandma did it instead. So she goes out for ice cream with Grandma instead of Grandpa. When they come back, they said to the little girl, well, how was it with Grandma? She said, well, it wasn't as much fun. She says, Grandma, it's not as much fun. She's so nice to everybody. She says, Grandpa points out who the idiots and the jerks are. Okay. See, we don't see what's out there. We see a lot what's inside of ourselves. Okay. And you're going to see mysticism a lot about seeing straight. Now, it's interesting. We'll give you just a couple more scriptural pieces on this. When you read John's Gospel, and in John's Gospel is a mystical gospel. And off and on this weekend, I'll touch on John's Gospel. He was a mystical writer. But in John's Gospel, he's very different than the Synoptic Gospels. He has two prototypes of discipleship, and they are Mary of Magdalene, who represents the woman, and she represents the woman from the Song of Songs. We'll look at some of those images tomorrow if we have time. She's in the garden. That's the Psalm of Psalms woman. She's in the garden, a place of lovers, looking for her loved one. Okay? But the other one is, he calls the disciple whom Jesus loved, the beloved disciple. We don't know who that is. We always think it was John. Maybe it is. We don't know. He deliberately fudges that, so that's because it's supposed to be you. And see, the disciple whom Jesus loved, he always sees through the eyes of love. So, now just think, John's Gospel was written in the 90s, so some 70 years after Jesus died. Peter had already been pope and martyred by that time. Now it's interesting, on Easter Sunday in the morning, Mary of Magdalene goes to the tomb. The tomb's empty. She comes running back to the disciple whom Jesus loved, and Peter's been the pope. And she said, the tomb's empty. So they said, the disciple whom Jesus loved and Peter, they both ran for the tomb, but the disciple whom Jesus loved got there first. Why? Because he was younger? No, because love outruns authority. But then he was a very good Catholic. He wouldn't go in. He waited till the Pope came, was a little slower. Okay. The Pope takes a look in, and he sees it, and he kind of gets, but he doesn't get it. He sees the cloth, and said, the disciple whom Jesus loved, he looked in, he saw, and he got it. See, as Victor of Hugo says, love is the eye. When you see through the eyes of love, you see straight. See, so that the one who loves Jesus, that person sees straight. You can be Pope, doesn't matter, you may not see straight, but the disciple whom Jesus loves sees straight. That opens the eyes. It's interesting, last thing on that, and that's the miracles of Jesus. Scholars, and they all agree on this, that, Jesus, and it's clear in Scripture, Jesus never does a miracle to try to prove that he's God. Never, In fact, every time they ask him to do it, he gives them a little scolding. He says, an adulterous and evil generation asks for a sign. No sign will be given it except the sign of Jonah, which is the resurrection sign, basically, He does miracles for two reasons. Jesus does miracles sometimes out of compassion. So he was moved by compassion, he healed somebody. Or sometimes he does a miracle to demonstrate God's power, not to prove he's God. He said, I want to show you that God has power in this world. It reveals God's power. Okay. Now, but it's interesting when you take the miracles, if you line them all up, they have a lot to do with the body, almost all of them, but they only have to do with certain parts of the body. He opens a lot of people's eyes. He has a lot of mute people that they can speak again. He cures a lot of lame people, so now they can walk again. Okay. He brings a couple of people back from the dead, so now that they're alive again. And in that powerful text where they put Jairus' daughter and the woman with the hemorrhage together in the same text, he's giving these two women the power, their fertility back, their generativity. See, the woman with the hemorrhage, she couldn't conceive because she was hemorrhaging all the time. And Jairus' daughter died just at the time when she would have got married. So he restores these women their power for generativity. Now, it's interesting, the miracles are always connected with these, seeing, generativity, walking. Notice he never takes out an appendix. Never. Because it wouldn't have been symbolic. Because those miracles are always more than the physical. They're physical. But see, he opens your eyes so he can see more deeply. He opens your mouth so now you can praise God. He gives you your legs back so now you can walk in the light. He opens ears so you can hear God's word. He restores them to life so that now they can bear children. See, the miracles always have that secondary thing, but especially the ones with the eyes. It's not just that now you can see with depth. You can see mystically. Okay, that's a little background to mysticism. Now, I've stalled long enough. What is mysticism? Okay. I'm going to take my favorite definition that I work with in my writing and teaching and so on. It comes from Ruth Burroughs. Ruth Burroughs is a British Carmelite. She's written a number of very good spiritual books, but she's written one of the direct books on mysticism. She has a book called Guidelines for Mystical Prayer. Guidelines for Mystical Prayer, but also I'll refer to her autobiography, which is a book called Before the Living God. Okay, now, Ruth Burroughs says this is mysticism, and later on I'm going to tell part of her story to illustrate this. It says mysticism. You see it on your yellow sheets. Mysticism is being touched by God at a level deeper than words, deeper than imagination, and deeper than feeling. That's quite a line. It says you are touched by God, but in a way that you can't think it, you can't feel it, and you can't express it. So how is that possible? Okay, well, you're going to see there's a difference between thinking and feeling and just knowing. Mysticism is knowing, and initially it's below the level. You don't think it, you don't feel it, you just know it. Okay, now, I want to tease that out with just a whole bunch of examples from philosophers, from poets, from mystics, from mythologists, and so on. How can you know something you don't think, feel, or can't express? I mean, later on you try to express it. I want to begin with Bernard Lonergan. Great intellectual, the last century. Bernard Lonergan, I'll just read the thing, then I'll try to explain it to you. Bernard Lonergan says, we're born with the brand of the first principles inside of ourselves. It's quite a line. He says, you are born with the brand of the first principles inside of yourself, and the first principles are four things. These are the transcendental properties of God. God is one, true, good, and beautiful. Okay. Those are the transcendental properties of God. God is one, true, good, and beautiful. And Bernard Lonergan says, when you're born, your soul isn't the white photographic piece of paper, what they used to call a tabula rasa. He said, your soul it's branded the way a cow is branded. He means branding here, not the way they mean it in the market today. The way a rancher brands a cow. It's just burned into you indelibly. He said, in your soul is indelibly burnt oneness, truth, goodness, and beauty. And they're there so you don't have to be taught them. You have to wake up to them. You have to get in touch with them. I want to say tomorrow, a mystically driven life is being in touch with them. They're already inside of you. You know, that God is one, true, good, beautiful. And that is why, for instance, we experience that. You know, when you're a kid, when you're a baby, and you're growing up, nobody has to tell you what's beautiful and what's ugly. You don't have long classes where the mother pulls the child apart and says, now see this sunset, that's beautiful, and see this garbage, that's ugly. You recognize that. See, we're not taught what's beautiful or what's ugly. We recognize beauty and we recognize ugliness because you already know them. You don't have to be taught goodness from badness. We can be malformed and we can be distorted. They're inside of us. You're going to see, as Christians, we've always called this conscience, but I'll say later, we use conscience far, far too narrowly. For most people, conscience means what's right or what's wrong. No. Conscience, you can see, is this deep, powerful center in which you know God's goodness, truth, oneness, beauty, you know. And you don't have to be taught these things. You wake up to them. And that is why in life, you know what our deepest learnings are? Our deepest, cathartic learnings are not what you learn how to use the computer or how to use, the latest app on your phone. That's just useful. It's when you learn something, I knew that. See, something really deep, I know it. You wake up to it. A contemporary mystic, and I call him that, and he is. Henri Nouwen was a contemporary mystic. And you know why Henri Nouwen was so powerful? You'd read him, and he kept introducing you to yourself. Well, look at, you say, yeah, I kind of knew that, except I didn't know it. See, and he's always pointing to, tomorrow I'm going to call it that touched place inside of you, that's already previously been touched. I say, but they reached the untouched place inside of you. No. Mysticism is reaching the touched place. See, God has already touched you. God has branded into your soul oneness, truth, goodness, beauty. Incidentally, I think we tend to more easily understand what goodness is, what truth is, what beauty is. What's oneness? Today, I think it's a pretty important thing for us to know. Oneness means there can't be contradictions. 1 and 1 can't be 2 and 3 and 4 at the same time. It can only be one thing. Today, if I can do a little footnote, we have a problem of truth in our whole society. Where 1 and 1 suddenly becomes 3. That's very dangerous. That's the most dangerous thing of all. See, we're fiddling with one of the transcendental properties of God. Incidentally, a little footnote on the side. Today, a lot of people who don't go to church, and they say, I'm religious but not spiritual. They might not even be explicitly religious. Oftentimes they are religious because they're stewarding one of those properties. So for instance, artists. A lot of artists don't go to church, but they protect beauty. They're going to live their life for creativity. That's one of God's transcendental properties. That's religious. Or somebody who's an intellectual, say, I'm about the truth, I want to discover truth. That's an intellectual property of God, And nobody had to put that inside of them. That's inside of themselves. That's our mystical center, okay? Now, Lonergan was a great intellectual, so he articulated that philosophically. It's a beautiful, he said, we're born with the brand of the first principles. Your soul is branded. You know goodness, oneness, truth, and beauty. So you know God in your soul. So you go through life, you're judging everything according to that. When our soul is functioning properly, we're judging all the time. Incidentally, another footnote. Jesus said, in John's Gospel, Jesus says, I judge no one. God judges no one. That doesn't mean there's any judgment. He said, no. God's light, God's truth, God's love, God's beauty come to the world, and we judge ourselves. God doesn't have to judge anybody. We judge ourselves. We know when we're telling a lie. We know when we're calling ugly beautiful and beautiful ugly and so on. And when we're true to what's deepest inside of us, we're living a mystically driven life. Now, I want to complement that with other sayings. He was a philosopher. Henri Nouwen was a spiritual writer, and Henri Nouwen coined it this way. Henri Nouwen says, the deepest thing says, we have an inchoate or a dark memory of first love. All of us have an unconscious, I don't like using the word unconscious because it's a psychological word, kind of an inchoate, kind of branded memory of first love. First love is not the first time you fell in love. The first time you fell in love, you recognize love because you were once perfectly loved by God before we were born. See, we have an unconscious memory of having once been loved perfectly. It's first love. Or Henri Nouwen says, you have an unconscious memory of once, he said, being caressed by hands far gentler than any you've met in this life. See, you've already been touched. Tomorrow when we look at Therese of Lisieux, I say, she'll put you in touch with the previously touched part inside of you. You don't need to get in touch with what's untouched inside of you. God has already touched you. Our deepest touch. Lonergan calls it the first principles. Nouwen calls it the memory of first love. And that's in our scriptures. Isaiah, through Jesus, and so on. Long before you were born, God loved you. We're born after we're loved, and so on. And we know that. See that? We come into the world knowing you've already known perfect love, you've already known perfect beauty, you've known perfect goodness. And that's why everything in this life is also pretty inadequate. You never get anything that fully measures up to the perfection you once had in God's womb. Okay, now it's interesting, the Stoics. the Greek Stoics, and if I wasn't a Christian, I'd be a Stoic. Actually, I'm a bit of a Stoic anyway, because my dad was one, I didn't have a choice. My dad wasn't a Greek Stoic, he was just a man who was pretty stoical in his character. Okay. But the Stoics were very religious. Now, they believed, and they didn't always believe in God, but they believed in something they called the good. And the good for them is exactly what we call God, except it wasn't always personal. They called it the good, but the good was perfect beauty, perfect truth, perfect love, perfect everything, perfect community. And they said, but they believed this. They said, before God puts the soul in the body, the last thing God does is kiss the soul. And then you always unconsciously remember that kiss your whole life, because you once kissed perfectly. In this life, you'll only be kissed imperfectly. So you're measuring present kisses against that former kiss. You already know what it means to be loved perfectly. In this life, you're going to be loved, but never perfectly. So you have that unconscious memory. He said, and that's why you're so restless. See, Augustine, before he became a Christian, was a Stoic. So, when Augustine became a Christian, he didn't have to change much. He took the word good and took one O out of it, and it became God, and he melted that with Scripture, and he gave us the, Christian theology for the next 1,700 years, But see, in fact, some of them had some very neat, kind of cute things with that. See, so they believed that God put the soul into the body just before the baby's born, or just when the baby's fully formed, so that, and that's why some of the medievals, even like Thomas Aquinas, didn't have any problem with abortion up to a certain point. They said, you only receive the soul when the body's perfectly formed, and this was their little cute thing. So they said, God puts the soul into the body, and the last thing God does after he puts the soul into the body, he seals your memory. He seals your memory so you can't remember where you were, and he does it by under your mouth, like seals your lips, and that's why you have a cleft under your nose. See, and they said, now this is the cute part, said, and that's also why every time you're trying to think or remember something, your finger inadvertently goes under your nose. Because you have long, long memories going back to long before you were born of God sealing your against the first principles. See, all of these things are saying the same thing. You were once perfectly loved, you knew perfect goodness and so on. You had perfect embrace. You were perfectly touched. And you don't remember that consciously. See, it's deeper than what you consciously feel or consciously think and so on. Now, let's take the next one. C.S. Lewis. Maybe the greatest Christian apologist we had in English, certainly in the last couple of centuries. But as you know, C.S. Lewis didn't grow up as a Christian. He went to adulthood and into his academic career as a hard atheist, or certainly a hard agnostic, okay? And then through the friendship with Tolkien, Lord of the Rings guy, Dorothy Sayers, Austin Farrer, Charles Williams, had this incredible group of Christians in Oxford at the time, He became friends with them, and slowly, through their conversations, they convinced him of Christianity. And so in his autobiography, a marvelous little book called Surprised by Joy, he writes about the night he first gave his life to Christ. And he said he had been out eating with all these friends. Then him and Tolkien took some long walks around the river in Oxford. And he said, finally, I was convinced. I was convinced that Christ was God. He said, and went back, he said, to my little rooms in Oxford. He said, and I knelt down for the first time. Now, it's what he's going to say afterwards that's significant. He said, I knelt down for the first time in my life. He said, but I knelt down as the most reluctant convert in the history of Christendom. Notice he didn't kneel down and say, well, praise be Jesus, I found it. He said, I knelt down as the most reluctant convert in the history of Christendom. He said, because I had come to know that the harshness of God is kinder than the softness of man, and God's compulsion is our liberation. It's quite a line. He said, I knelt down, not because I felt very good about it. He said, I knelt down because I had to. He said, God's compulsion is our liberation. That's quite an expression. What is God's compulsion, and how do we feel God's compulsion? Here again, I'm going to go into Scripture to interpret this. In John's Gospel, and this is the breaking point in John's Gospel for Jesus. You know, in all the Gospels, there's a similar scene. Jesus comes on the scene, does some miracles. He's very, very popular, but by the time he dies, they're hollering, crucify him. But in John's Gospel, he loses the crowd on the basis of one homily, okay? He's preaching on the bread of life. And he says to the Jews, he says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't have life within you. Now, they were Jews, and they were hearing cannibalism. So he's saying, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, John said, then all the crowd walked away. And they said, this is intolerable language. They couldn't take it, you know. So they all walked away except the 12 in John's Gospel. Jesus turns to the 12 and he says, do you want to walk away too? And Peter gives a very enthusiastic answer. He said, we'd like to, but we have no other place to go. There's an answer for you. First of all, there's actually a lot of an answer. There's a lot of humility and vulnerability in that answer. You know, sometimes in human life, in our commitments, we stay, there isn't any other place to go. Okay? But that's not the important part of the answer. He said, we have no other place to go. Besides, we know that you have the words of everlasting life. Now, that's quite a statement. That's a raw statement of faith. He's looking at Jesus, and this is what he's saying to Jesus. He said, you know, today you sound like death. What you say we don't get, and what we get we can't accept. And we'd like to walk away, except we know at a different level that this is going to bring us life. Now, notice that's not in their heads, it's not in their hearts. It's at a different place of them. You know, that's a perfect example. Let's C.S. Lewis. I don't want this in my head. I don't want this in my heart, but I know I have to do this. You're going to see your mystical center, you see what I call your ought center. You know, what do I have to do? Not what do I want to do. You know, pardon the word I'm going to use, but it makes it clear, and it comes from Daniel Berrigan, the great Jesuit, you know. But Berrigan was once being interviewed. He was a Jesuit priest and a great social justice figure. And this woman asked him, she says, Father, she was a Jesuit priest, she said, where does faith reside? Is faith in your head or faith in your heart? I could ask you that question. Where is your faith? Is faith in the head, faith in the heart? And Berrigan said, it's neither. He said, faith is rarely in your head, and it's even less rarely in your heart. He said, faith isn't where your head is at. He said, faith isn't where your heart is at. Pardon the expression. Faith is where your ass is at. He said, I'm not trying to be cute. He says, it's in your doing. Where are you sitting? What are your commitments? He said, anybody who's been in any commitment for any length of time, be it in a marriage, be it in the priesthood, be it in ministry, be it in justice, you know there's going to be whole seasons where your head isn't in it, your heart isn't in it, but you're in it. Why do you go to church every Sunday? A lot of Sundays, your head isn't there, your heart isn't there, but you're there. It's like Peter, you know, you sound like death, except we know, we don't feel it, that this is going to bring us life. See, then you're acting out of your mystical center. You know, we have an expression in English, which oftentimes we don't tease out, when they say, this rings true, or this rings false. To what? Is there a little bell inside of us? Okay. No. It rings true to all the human time. It rings true to the first principles. It rings true to the kiss of God that you vaguely remember. It rings true to that ought center. I have to do this. And that's your mystical center. And that's also what Christians call conscience. See, conscience isn't just a little voice inside of you that tells you what's right and what's wrong. In fact, that little voice oftentimes can't be trusted, you know, because that's also sometimes we can feel things are wrong and they're not wrong, and we can feel things are right and they're not right. It's what Freud called the superego and so on. That at a deeper level where we just know. Okay. When you feel guilt about something, does that tell you whether you did right or wrong? No. It just tells you about how you feel about what you did. You can feel guilt about things that aren't wrong at all, and you might not feel any guilt at all about things that are wrong. See, that's the level of feeling. At the level of knowing, it's different. Remember that. Guilt doesn't tell you whether you've done right or wrong. Feelings feel. They only tell you about how you feel about what you did. And some people feel too much guilt. Some don't feel enough guilt. Okay. Now, a couple more, and then I want to go into teasing some of this out. I'm going to talk tomorrow about intimacy, what we call the mystical body of Christ. So I'm going to leave that. And the Hebrew notion of knowledge is intimacy. I want to end with two things. One is a story. Remember, we're saying, how can you know something, or how can something be deeper than what you think and what you feel? Okay? Well, a brand is deeper than what you think and what you feel, but just tell you a story and I'll try to explicate that. A priest friend of mine tells a story. It just happened a couple of weeks ago. He said they were out, a group of his old classmates and so on from college, and one of the men was sharing, he said, how his life had simply imploded in the last few months. He said, whatever can happen to a man that's bad has happened to me. He said, my marriage broke up. He said, my wife left me. He said, and then I lost my job. He said, and then I was diagnosed with cancer. He said, so what else can happen to a guy? Marriage, job, possibly my life. So one of the men said to him, but how do you really feel? He said, well, what the hell, what do you mean, how do I really feel? I just told you, I lost my wife, I lost my job, I may lose my life. He said, no, but underneath that, where are you? See, it's a good question. See, we think with our head, we feel with our heart, but notice even the way I'm wording it. You think with your head, you feel with your heart, but who's the you? Your head is an instrument you're using. Your heart is an instrument you're feeling with. Who's behind that? See, there's something deeper than head. There's something deeper than heart. There's something deeper than thinking. There's something deeper than feeling, and it's what we call knowing. Sometimes you just know. And this isn't wildly abstract. Many of you in this room, you've been parents. You're parents. Remember something you tell your kids, why can't I do that? It's wrong. Why? I just know. Sometimes you just know. Okay? You can't express it, and so on. And you're going to see mysticism is trying to give expression to that. The same as theology. All of theology is partly mystical expression. Remember, theology is faith trying to express itself. Faith trying to articulate itself. Okay? Now, the last one, John of the Cross, the great mystic. John of the Cross is, when you get to a certain level in your life, and I wish I had time to, I was thinking of doing John of the Cross, and I thought, well, Teresa's going to, lay this out a little clearer. If I had lots of time, I'd do John of the Cross. Because John of the Cross is such a nuanced and structural thinker. But he says, when you reach a certain point in your life, this is a direct quote, he says, the deeper things now lie under the surface, and you need to learn to understand more by not understanding than by understanding. That sounds like a contradiction. He says, it's the route to deeper maturity, where you learn to understand more by not understanding than by understanding, and you realize that the deeper things happen under the surface. Let me just tease out that first part. We're going to come back on the deeper understanding. How can deeper things be happening under the surface? Okay, let's take relationships. And imagine this. Imagine your mother is in a senior's home, assisted living, and you're the dutiful daughter, or you're the dutiful son, and you happen to be living very close by. So this goes on for some years, and every night, 5 times a week, after work, you stop, you spend an hour with your mother, helping her have her dinner, helping her get settled for the night, and so on. You do this 5 days a week, During the course of a year, how many times do you think you'll have an interesting, stimulating conversation with your mother? Once? Maybe not at all. And what are you doing the other nights? You're talking about the weather, did the sports team win, did the kids come home, what's happening, was Trump on the news, and on. You're making all this small talk, okay? But you're seeing her every day. Now imagine your sister who's conveniently living in Alaska, okay? Which is real nice, because she doesn't have to see her mother every day. She comes home twice a year. You know what happens? When she comes, her and her mother, they do have deep conversations. They're crying and hugging each other, and and you could kill them both. Okay. That's what your sister has when she comes home twice a year, deeper than what you have? No, it's real superficial. You've already had that with your mother. The reason you're not saying a lot of deep things, there's nothing left to say. You're relating at a different level. When your mother dies, you're going to be the closest person to her in the whole world by a long, long shot. Not because the deep conversation is happening below. Incidentally, those of you who do contemplative prayer and centering prayer, that's what it's based on. See, in discursive prayer, you go and you talk to God, and you hug and you cry and you do all kinds of stuff. After a few years of that, there's nothing left to do. You just go and you sit. You're just there. I've lived some summers with the Trappists in Snowmass, and when they go to pray, when they go to say Mass or the office, they call that praying. When they go to meditate, they call it sitting. They don't even call it prayer. They have a different name. You go and you just have a sit with God. See, you're going to have a sit with your mother. It's totally unimportant what's said. It's only important that you're there. And you know something? If you fall asleep, it's even better. We're going to look at Therese of Lisieux tomorrow. Therese of Lisieux was once asked, someone said, is it wrong to fall asleep when you pray? And she said, no. She said, a little child is equally pleasing to her parents, awake or asleep, probably more asleep. No, that isn't just cute. You're coming home from work, and you're tired, and your mother's eating, and finally you drift off for 10 minutes, It's wonderful. You're there. You go to chapel, you sit down, you drift off for 10 minutes. It's wonderful. You're there. Your sister who comes once a year, she doesn't drift off. They're hugging and crying. That's oftentimes what you get from religious neophytes. They haven't seen Jesus for 5 years. They go into church and it's all emotional. Oh, Jesus. And so, well, he hasn't seen you for 5 years. That'll be a nice airport meeting, If you pray regularly, you go every day, you're visiting your mother, at a certain point, it's all happening under the surface. Notice it's not happening at the level of thought or feeling. See, we do so much at the level of thought or feeling. Mysticism is when we're acting out underneath that. The you, not the head, not the heart. They're wonderful. You think with your head, you need to respect your head. You feel with your heart, you need to respect those feelings and so on. That's not you. That's not your center. Okay, now, top of page 2. Okay. Mysticism is an ordinary experience for everyone. I want to start this and talk about what is a mystic. See, so mysticism can be extraordinary experience, as I said. Some of the great mystics, Julian of Norwich, Teresa of Avila, Hildegard of Bingen, some of these people, they had real visions, okay? Most mystics didn't. And actually, John of the Cross is a great mystic, never draws on any of his visions, ever, They say mysticism, it's knowing the difference between knowing, thinking, and feeling. See, you're a mystic to the extent, or you're having mystic experience to the extent that you're drawing on that. I'm going to give you an example in a few minutes. Okay, now, but there's also a difference between having a mystical experience and being a mystic. See, there are very few real mystics. That doesn't mean the rest of us don't have mystical experience. The analogy here is the same as, for instance, in the aesthetic world. All of us have deep aesthetic experiences. You can watch a sunset and get tears in your eyes, but you can't necessarily paint it. You can listen to music, or you have music in your head that brings tears in your eyes. Inside of each one of it, there is a great artist. There's a great painter. There's a great dancer, but we can't do it. but the great ones can. So Mozart can write the symphony, Picasso can paint the picture, See, we have the experience, but we can't articulate it. So, what makes a mystic? A mystic is somebody, their experience isn't necessarily deeper than ours, but they can give it aesthetic articulation, Tomorrow I'm going to compare the Diary of Anne Frank to the writings of Thérèse of Lisieux, and you're going to see, first of all, they're both great artists. For instance, Anne Frank wrote a diary. Millions and millions of young girls have written diaries. What makes her special? Aesthetic expression. Here's a kid with a great education. That's a masterpiece. That's a painting. The clarity of the language and so on. Now, let's apply it today. One of the great mystics of our own time was Henri Nouwen. You know why? He could shine a flashlight into his own experience and then articulate it in such a way that it shines a flashlight into everybody's experience. Henri Nouwen, the reason he touched, and he's probably certainly the most popular spiritual writer in the last 60 or 70 years and so on, and across religious boundaries and so on. But if you read his writings, first of all, Henri Nouwen was a pretty tortured soul, so he was a saint, but not exactly the way Mother Teresa was. Okay. Henri Nouwen was a saint, but he was a tortured saint. He could always keep, willing to one thing, but with great difficulty. So, for instance, when you read his diaries, and he published his diaries, so in his Genesee diary, he writes, he says, see if you can relate to this. Nouwen says, I want to be a great saint, but I also want to experience all the sensations that sinners experience. He said, I want to have a deep life of prayer. He said, but I don't want to miss anything in life. He said, I want to have a radical lifestyle for the poor, but I want to fly around in airplanes and visit the Hermitage. He said, see, I want the right things, but I want everything. See, he said, like Kierkegaard said, to be a saint is to will the one thing. We will the one thing, but we will everything else. But see, Nouwen could articulate this. And at the same time, we'd recognize ourselves. And then he'd say, now, how do you get beyond this? Well, you don't get beyond it in the level of your feelings. You get beyond it at the level of prayer. It was interesting. Twice, he checked himself into a clinic for clinical depression because he was a celibate who was obsessed in love and he couldn't act out. Powerful honesty, He said, I want to show you how inside of all these tormenting feelings and your obsessions, how you can be a saint, or even how you can receive love. It's interesting, here was a man who had an astonishing success in his life, So he wrote 60 books. He was tenured at Harvard and Yale, and they were trying to get him to teach, and he's trying to escape from the academic world and so on. And he had all this adulation. Something, before he went to live with handicapped people, he couldn't receive any of it. It just went through him like water. He said, I just couldn't receive love. He'd get depressed and check into clinics, and he says, I have an unfulfilled need, just no amount of affection does it for me, and so on. That's interesting. When he went to live with people who couldn't pronounce his name, didn't know he wrote every book, he was able to receive love. Great paradox, and so on. It was the only place he could receive love. But see, he was a mystic. He had, he was always deeply in touch with the kiss of God inside of him. He says, I know God has caressed me long before I was born, and I'm hungry to touch this kiss in this life. Okay, now, he was living a mystically driven life. But I want to give you, this is my clearest example, and it comes from Ruth Burroughs. So Ruth Burroughs, the British Carmelite, who's now 96 and healthy. She wrote me at Christmas and said, I'm finally retiring. She said, no more public, she doesn't go public, but she said, no more, I'm not writing anymore, no more books, anything. She said, I'm finally going to hide myself away here, 96, so. But she tells her story in her book called Before the Living God. And this is her story, very interesting. And I'm using that as my ultimate example here of mysticism, mystically driven life. She grew up in England. She said, our family wasn't religious. She said, we weren't religious at all. But her family sending to a boarding school run by sisters. Not for the religion, because it was an elite school which would get her into a better university. So she goes to this school, boarding school, for 3 or 4 years, Catholic sisters. She's not at all serious about religion, couldn't care less. She's going there for the education. Said, and on your senior year, they had a retreat. They had to go to a retreat center for a week. She said her and another girl were particularly obnoxious. They were acting out all the time. They wouldn't keep the silence and so on. So finally one of the sisters pulled them aside and said, we're separating you from the group. You're a bad influence on the group. And said, now whenever they go into session with talks, you have to come to chapel with me and sit in absolute silence for those hours. So the sister would take them into chapel, and her and this other girl, and they would simply have to sit for several hours in silence so many times a day. And Burroughs said at the beginning, we resented, and we'd be winking at each other and trying to get notes to each other and so on. But she said those hours, they were long. She said, and one day she says, I simply had a moment of clarity. She said it wasn't an angel appeared or the Holy Spirit. She said, I simply had a moment of clarity. She said, where I knew myself. I knew myself. She said, I saw myself for who I was, both in terms of God's child, but both in terms of being an airheaded 18-year-old kid, who didn't know up from down. She said, I just had a moment of clarity in which I knew myself. From that, changed her life. She became Carmelite nun against her family's wishes, eventually became the prioress, wrote many spiritual books and so on. See, she said, that's mysticism. It wasn't like God appeared or an angel. She said, I had a moment of clarity where she touched that part, where she, however unconsciously, remembered the kiss, however unconsciously she felt the brand of those first principles. But she said, it wasn't like a revelation. She said, it was a moment of clarity, where I see straight, inside and outside. See, that's mystical experience, and we have those moments. And as I'm going to submit today and tomorrow, to live a mystically driven life is to get in touch with that. When are you most you? When do you see straight? And so on. See, and then we have to live our lives out of that. Okay. Dag Hammarskjöld, those of you a little older remember this man. He was Swedish, Secretary General of the United Nations, and while he was Secretary General, he wrote one book, which is actually a profound spiritual book, but it wasn't explicitly Christological. So he wrote this book called Markings. But remember, the most famous line, probably the most quoted line from Markings, is a line you've probably all heard, where Dag Hammarskjöld, who was a remarkably moral man, he said, I don't know who put the question, and I don't exactly know when I answered it, but I know that at one time in my life, I said yes to something higher than myself, and since then, he said, my life has been a life of self-surrender and of deep meaning. And he said, I don't know who put the question. I don't remember asking it. I just remember sometime I said yes to something higher than myself. He said, now my life is a life of self-surrender. It's a life of deep meaning. He had a moment of clarity. Just, who am I? What does life mean? It wasn't, he didn't say, an angel appeared to me, and so on. I give you some quotes at the beginning taken from him, where he says, character and greatness are predicated on mirroring with purity the grace and greatness of life. Notice he doesn't say finding the greatness of life, or he said mirroring, it's already inside of you. See, we're made in God's image and likeness. The greatness is already inside of you. All of that is inside of you. Our task is to mirror it, but we have to touch it in order to mirror it. Okay. Now, a couple of more things, then we'll go into question period. Living the mystically driven life. Let me just take a little swallow here. As it relates to conscience, I've talked about that. See, our conscience isn't just a little voice box that tells right from wrong. Our conscience is when we're touching the first principles, when we're touching the kiss of God, then we know how we should live. Okay. Then, it also, as it relates to decision making. It's interesting, I don't know how many of you have been trained here in Carmelite discernment as opposed to Jesuit discernment. If you're a Carmelite, John of the Cross was a mystic. Notice his rules for discernment are quite different from Ignatian rules. In the end, they'll come out to the same thing. But see, in Ignatius, you make lists, you compare where you're going. With John of the Cross, he says, no. He said, you go into the stillest hour of your night, and you ask yourself, what do I have to do? You don't have to make any lists. You have to get in touch with your heart and say, what do I have to do here? Not what do I want to do? What do I think is smart to do? What do I have to do? See, that's Peter before Jesus. You want to walk away? I'd like to, but I can't. I have to stay. You bring life. Okay. Then as it relates to love, I want to make a footnote here. As it relates to discerning in love, I worked for some years as a counselor, and I worked with young people, trying to make a decision to get married. I'd ask this question what kind of love do you know that this is love you're going to be able to marry, John, as opposed to you can fall in love with 100 people for all the wrong reasons, and we all do, and what kind of love is love for, all love is real, but what kind of love makes for a marriage? Okay. It's got to be love that brings you home. See, when you're in love with somebody, with this person is taking you home. You can have a honeymoon, very good honeymoon with a lot of people. You just need a good credit card. Okay. But from honeymoons you go home. Okay. A marriage it's meant to be your home. That's also true for sexuality. What's wrong with sexual hookup and so on? It's the antithesis of what sex is supposed to. Sex is supposed to take you home. I'll give you a powerful story. When I was provincial, I was teaching some extension course at the University of Saskatchewan. And I'd get some pretty existential students. And I'd ask them to read this book. And the book was, the course was called Christian Spirituality. So I would have a section on sexuality, marriage. And I gave them a book to read, and still a worthwhile book reading, from a New Jersey-based writer called Christopher DeVink. It's one of the first books he wrote. He has a beautiful little book wrote it way back in the early 90s, called Precious Memories for a Faithless Time. It's called Precious Memories for a Faithless Time. It's a series of essays about his relationship to his wife, and raising kids and so on. And it's not over the top idealistic, it's a very warm book. So I asked the students to read this. A young woman came into my room, my office, 30 years old. Very bright, existential woman, a religious searcher, wasn't going to any church. She says, Father, she says, this book, she had tears in her eyes, says, that's the most powerful book I've ever read. She said, something? She said, I thought it was so bright in my generation. She said, I have slept my way through 2 provinces. She said, but now I realize what I want is what he has, which is a marriage bed. I need sex to take me home, not to take me from one bar to the next. See, she had touched her mystical center, or this book helped her touch her mystical center. It says, I need something to take me home, because that's where I'm real. We're not real in promiscuity and so on. We go home from that, We're not real in a lot of kinds of love. The love is real, we're not real. It's not us. This is the way she put it so powerful. She said, I need sex to take me home, not to be something I do away from home. See, his book, DeVink's book, had very powerfully touched that. She touched the first principle inside of herself. Said, this is not that I'm committing mortal sins or whatever. She says, this is not taking me home. I have a longing for home. Okay. That's living the mystically driven life. I want to stop here and take some questions, because we're going to pick some of this up tomorrow. But again, just to summarize, mysticism isn't extraordinary. It's extraordinary to be a gifted mystic, like the same it's extraordinary to be a gifted musician or an artist, But we have mystical experiences, and they're ordinary. You don't have to have an angel appear to you or whatever. It's your mystical center is that ought center, that center where you are real. It's the deepest, truest part of your conscience. When you touch that and you live out of that, you're living a mystically driven life. like Peter. He says, I'd like to walk away, but I can't. I got to stay because I know you're going to bring me life. This young woman says, I was on the wrong track because this wasn't taking me home. Said, I read this stuff, this is taking me home. It's taking me to where I'm real. See, and that's going to be the purpose of the talks. What takes you home? What makes you real? Who is the real you? And when you're touching that, you're living the mystically driven life. And it's beyond thought. It's beyond you. Sometimes we sense it or we feel it, but it's like John of the Cross. The deeper things are happening under the surface. And we got to be able to touch those deeper things. What's happening between you and your mother when you're visiting her every day, year after year, and you're talking about the weather? Something deep is happening, Deeper than what happens to you sometimes in church when you're praying in tongues, That's good too for neophytes. Okay, we have a little time, and that's probably as much as you want to absorb tonight, or probably more than you want to absorb tonight. But if any questions or comments or reactions would be welcome. And is there a microphone, or you just... Okay. There's one, and then over here.
So this brings me back to what is a practicing mystic, and how do you practice being a mystic? That at the beginning you said you do believe that is possible.
Good question. So with that being said, how do you practice as a mystic? Well, the same way as you can practice as an artist, you can practice as a musician, you can practice as in anything. Doesn't mean we're ever going to get to the level of John of the Cross. So for instance, I know a lot of people who paint, but they're never going to sell their paintings. And they're never going to be Picasso, but they're painting and they're practicing painting. I know a lot of people trying to write music. They might never be Mozart or even Paul McCartney, but they're writing music. And I want to say something further on that. See, today I think we get intimidated to practice something unless we're going to get absolute professional at it. See, why paint if you can't sell a painting? Why write music if you're never going to, play in a band or something? Well, that's where we're losing. You do it not because you want to do it, because it's good for your soul. Remember earlier on, he wrote some very fine books. He still writes books, but Thomas More, not the English martyr, but the intellectual here from the East Coast, the book Care of the Soul, Soulmates, Re-enchantment of the Soul. He says, see, you need to do these things, not that there's anything pragmatic to them at all, because they're good for the soul, You grow a garden not because you can't buy stuff at the local, food market. You buy it because it's good for the soul. Why do we put flowers up in front here? They have no practical value whatsoever. It's good for the soul. See, so a practicing mystic is somebody who's tried the same as you can be a practicing theologian. You might never be Karl Rahner or Karl Barth, but you're trying to articulate your faith. See, so it's important to try to articulate. And a lot of people actually, how a lot of people are practicing mystics? In their journals. That's exactly what journaling at its best is. You're a practicing mystic, which means you're trying to say, like, what's happening in my life, and where am I missing the mark, and why do I feel this way, and so on. See, that's a practicing mystic. You're saying, I'm trying to get in touch with what's true and what's real inside of me and what's out there, and this journalism is helping. A lot of times when you write something on paper, you see it more clearly. It helps you to articulate it. It's an excellent question. Like most deep journaling that, it's not just a day book. I journal, but because I don't have a lot of time, half the time it's a day book. I went here and I had a hamburger for supper, and, that's not practicing mysticism. It's just keeping a diary. My day at the zoo, okay? But see, most journaling is practicing mysticism. You are trying to get in touch with your soul and trying to articulate the movements of your soul, which is really the essence of journaling. That's practicing mysticism. That's what Henri Nouwen did, except he was able to do it in such a way that, look, there's a very tricky formula with that. Nouwen was able to reveal the inside of his soul without being exhibitionistic. That's really tough. See, most writers, spiritual writers, they're too safe, so they don't touch your soul enough. Others say a little more than I want to know. See, you have to be able to, a good writing mystic like Henri Nouwen, and all of them, Teresa of Avila, the great ones, they can reveal deep personal movement without being exhibitionistic, See, that they never cross the aesthetic line so that, it's too saccharine, or it's in your face, or it's making you uncomfortable, and so on. But see, in your journal, you don't have to worry about that, And when you journal, in fact, you shouldn't worry about that. If you want to publish your journals, you first edit them. But in the unedited version, you try to touch your soul. You try to, and so, see, you're writing about the movements of your soul, and that's practicing mysticism. The same as you can be a practicing artist. Okay. Okay, she was first, and there's two more over there, but, yeah, here.
Can you talk a little more about beauty? Because I am not a mystic, but when I see beauty, especially now, especially this spring, it feels like that. And what is it? What is the difference between, because we think of different things as being beautiful, but it has a sense of that's it. And I also want to just mention that I think when you talk about the journal, that poetry probably has, it almost takes you away into writing something that maybe you don't deliberately write.
Yeah, great question, the question about beauty. Remember when I said that beauty is one of the transcendental properties of God, okay? So when you are moved by beauty, you're being moved by God, okay? And see, it's a mystical experience in this sense, that see, when you're struck by beauty, suppose like you just walk out and say, wow, see this touching, see, that is touching that previously touched part in you. That's recalling the kiss of God. You once knew perfect beauty. See, and those moments precisely, they put you in touch with who you really are. Notice after that, you don't want to murder somebody. You don't remember a grudge immediately. You don't want to tear somebody's head off. Notice, because it's touching a deep part of you, and it's centering you in God. Beauty is part of God. We can call it that, or a mathematician, bless them, because I'm not one. Well, all of a sudden they work out a perfect equation, they have a catharsis. I mean, it's just the beauty of this structure fitting together is like you looking at the sunset or something. See, and it centers them, and ultimately it's centering them in God, because God is truth. And see, and when we have those experiences, or an experience of love, it's not then when you want to kill somebody and remember that your mother loved your sister better than she loved you and all that, which we normally, when we're not living a mystically driven life, we remember every wound and every anger and who wasn't nice to us, and I was bringing that out, and then you remember your mother did love your sister better than you, and see, but when you have an experience of truth or beauty or goodness and mystical, in those moments, you don't go there, you transcend. Right after you have that experience, you don't want to kill anybody, and you're forgiving your mother and your sister, for those moments, and that's mysticism. Now, if you go and journal about it, it's helpful because you maybe keep it alive longer, you can integrate it more into your life and so on. See, so when you have the experience, you have to try to not just have them episodically, or but that you start integrating as a practicing mystic, so that you do forgive your mother, not just for that 1 minute. It's a great question.
I was really fascinated by your choice of the word driven. what is a mystically driven life? And I wonder if you'd say a little bit about that?
I'll tell you why I picked it. Well, partly because it was a hip word. Okay, no, but because remember when I talked about C.S. Lewis? It's a compulsion. See, notice C.S. Lewis says, the compulsion of God is our liberation. See, it's sometimes like Peter, notice he doesn't want to stay with Jesus. He has to, So there's a certain drivenness, and you see it. Now again, to make it even less abstract, look at somebody like Mother Teresa. She was a great woman. Would you say she was a driven woman? Oh, absolutely. She was like a snowplow. If you got in her way, she just rolled over you. See, saints are driven people, and so that, was Henri Nouwen a driven person? Absolutely. Was Jean Vanier, incidentally, Jean Vanier is dying right now. I mean, he's in hospice and so on. They're preparing his obituary, so he was a driven person, In fact, one time in Edmonton, I was giving a talk and I was saying, people are really free and so on. I used Jean Vanier, and some woman came up during the break and says, do you know what you said? She said, I've lived with him. He's one of the most driven men I've ever See, saints, Mother Teresa was a driven woman, She's a saint. So, but I'm using it because of the compulsion. See, it's not something you say, well, I think I want to be a good person or whatever. You got to be driven to that, So you're not free, See, Peter wasn't free to walk away from Jesus. Well, we say there's a difference between your radical freedom and your existential freedom. Radically, he was free to walk away. Existentially, he wasn't. The same as radically, any of us can just walk away from the faith and say, I don't need church, I don't need any of this in my life. Existentially, you can't. You got to say, it's not like Peter, I'd like to walk away. And there's all of you in church, many times in our commitments, you want to walk away, I remember going to a wedding anniversary, someone their 60th anniversary, and someone said, what was it like, ever thought of divorce? And the man said, divorce, no. He said, murder, yes, And the same, there's times you want to just walk away from your church, slam the door in its face, and so on in your marriage. But you stay there because it's going to bring you life, because you have to,
What drives?
What draws is the kiss of God.
What is doing the driving?
The kiss of God. You can't forget the memory. You can't let it go. The same as sometimes, let me give you a horror, the reverse. Freud always said you understand things in the reverse. Sometimes you have a memory that's just obsessive. Somebody who hurt you, and you'd like to let it go, and you just can't let it go. This is obsessing you. Okay? Now, this memory is there, not in such an obsessive way, but it's never going to let you go. You simply, if you walk away from God, it's something inside of you is not letting you free, and that's not abstract, That's why there's, there's a lot of breakdown and all kinds of, we can't walk away from morality. We can't walk away from goodness. When we do, we can only do it at the choice of self-destruction. Teilhard de Chardin, it's a great, great line. Teilhard de Chardin says, at a certain point in life, you come to realize, it's unconscious, that you only have two choices in life. You can genuflect before God or start self-destructing. There's any other. There's no neutral way. And Augustine would say the same thing in different language. Augustine say, you can never be neutral. You are either growing or you're falling apart. See, so that, like Teilhard, at a certain point, you're either genuflecting, you're acquiescing to God's will, or you become self-destructive. Now, it's not true for little kids and so on. That's at a maturity point in your life, And see, so it is a compulsion. You have to do this. If you don't do it, you're going to start self-destructing. Well, I admit I was using a little bit to pirate off Rick Warren, but okay. He's coming.
Is it hard to live with a mystic?
That's actually a very good question. Is it hard to live with a mystic? depends, and I don't say this lightly, is it hard to live with a saint? Sometimes yes. I'm not sure I would have always wanted to live with Mother Teresa or be across from her at the table, There's a lot of jokes wouldn't be told. Because oftentimes they are driven people. Now, it isn't always true. Sometimes you get, or like Henri Nouwen, a lot of people live with Henri Nouwen. They said he wasn't an easy guy to live with. He was a wonderful person to live with, but not necessarily an easy person to live with, See, so that's a good question, but it's a tricky question. There are saints who come across serene, and there are saints who come across as pretty driven people, They're great people. So, do you want to live with a mystic? For instance, I know Ruth Burroughs a little bit. I think she's a wonderful woman. I was totally surprised the first time I met her, because I was expecting, after reading her books, this driven woman was completely relaxed. Or in fact, you may know, because she lived in the property, was one of Ruth's own mentors and a great friend, his sister Wendy Beckett, who just died, the art critic. She lived in that property, and Wendy, who was a saint, was just one of the most marvelous human people you'd ever meet, she was Mother Teresa, but with a different type of tonality to her, I remember going to a restaurant with her, and she always had this full habit on, and this waiter came over. He needed oxygen, and he said, sister, he said, could I bring you some water? She said, water is for washing, bring me some wine. Okay. And they had a great relationship for the rest of the evening and so on. So I'm going to answer it this way. Depends who the mystic is. There's mystics who I want to be around, but not at table with all the time. And there are. See, you want Mother Teresa's around. You don't necessarily always want to be sitting beside her at table. Good question. One last one. Okay. Oh, there's somebody up here as well. So.
You commented earlier about the trend of a lot of people not being connected to institutional church or religion. How do you recognize mystics among those folks?
Okay, I'll repeat it because some people said, I commented earlier about people who are not connected to institutionalized religion. How do you recognize those who are mystics, or who are living mystically driven lives? Well, that the generic answer is easy, because I can just quote Jesus. Teasing it out is a little more difficult. Remember Jesus, by your fruits you will know them. So that, and actually it works out. If somebody's life is marked by charity, by peacefulness, that's good. If it isn't, conversely, no matter how religious they are, it's not good. And maybe I shouldn't give this example here, but since I'm in a Unitarian church, I'll give it, I know a lot of right-wing Christians who are really negative on Unitarians, and, well, they don't believe in anything, and so on. Well, a lot of times they're a lot nicer than some Christians who are really nasty. See, Jesus said, it's by your fruits you know them, not by whoever's, praying or reading the Bible or whatever. And so that, they struggle the same way we do, So, for instance, I used the example of a person they're deeply committed to Jesus, and they have absolute blind spots in their lives where they can be hateful people. Well, it's the same thing sometimes, too. You can have somebody, they're an artist, and in the area of beauty, they're a saint. But sometimes it doesn't translate into other areas. But in that area, that's religiosity. I want to hang a statement out there. When you talk to what they call nuns, not religious nuns, but people who write on their census form, religion, nun, if you ask them, they almost always have the answer, why? They'll always say this, I just can't believe it anymore. Okay? Now, the interesting thing is, what's the it? I can't believe it anymore. It doesn't necessarily mean they don't believe in God. They can't believe in what they've heard about God and the institutional churches and stuff they've been connected to. That's not necessarily, and sometimes maybe it's good they don't believe it, because we hear about God and Christ in all the wrong ways sometimes, where our churches can be all wrong and sometimes, so they should be rejected, you know. They're not necessarily rejecting God. They're not necessarily rejecting Christ, you know. And to the degree that they're precisely not rejecting beauty, goodness, truth, and oneness, they're not rejecting God, you know. If someone says, I don't believe 2 and 2 is 4 anymore, I can make it whatever I want, that's serious. Then they're not believing in God, you know. Because they're rejecting God's property. Or someone says, I just want to spit on beauty. I want to take every beautiful painting in the world and destroy it. See, that's badness. That's not believing in God. Some 21-year-old says, I don't believe it anymore. It's a lot to do with the it, you know. In fact, I'm sure some of you read a very famous book the last few years, Jordan Peterson's book. What's it called? The 12 Rules for Life or whatever. But it's interesting. He writes as an agnostic. He's just prof at the University of Toronto, and that's probably the most reviewed book in the last 2 years anywhere, you know. And but he said, I was raised in a very shallow Christianity, he said, which I rejected. But then he writes this book in which he lands solidly with the Sermon on the Mount, as Jesus is the ultimate moral teacher of all time, and so on. So, but he says, I rejected a shallow Christianity that I was taught in, you know. Hasn't necessarily rejected Christianity. He thinks he has, but then he lands solidly Christian, because he would believe in everything that's one, true, good, and beautiful, you know. He wouldn't just call it God. And there are people who, all of us, who believe in God, but sometimes we reject oneness, truth, goodness, and beauty. And then we're not believers at that moment. Remember, Jesus says, it's not necessarily those who say, Lord, Lord, who will enter the kingdom of heaven. It's the one who does the will of God on earth. Makes some sense? You're all okay yet? Nobody's throwing anything? Or... Okay, I was talking with Margaret when we were coming back. We said, like, in open space methodology, they say, when it's over, it's over. Okay. I have a sense this is over. Thanks.